Hi, and welcome. The event is now live. John, please take it away.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's live tech talk. Who's backing up your Microsoft 365 configuration, closing the hidden resilience gap? This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, and it's sponsored by CoreView, helping enterprises take control of Microsoft 365 with a platform designed to strengthen governance, simplify administration, improve security, and reduce unnecessary cloud spend. I'm John K. Waters, editor-in-chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'm joined today by John Stevenson, Senior Product Marketing Manager at CoreView. Hi, John.
Hi there, John. Pleasure to meet you. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see that so many people have decided to join us so we can have a look at the issues around tenant resilience and talk them through.
Well, I'll tell you, folks, John is exactly the industry veteran I want to talk to. He's been at this for 30 plus years. He's been in the cybersecurity space, spanning anti-malware, email and web defenses, access management, and the protection of air-gapped networks. And he's the perfect SME for today. But before we get going, I need to do just a little bit of housekeeping. This Tech Talk is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. Our sponsors provided some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. And at the end of the conversation, we'll have a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. Please type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our very, very best to get to all of them. Now, let me set the stage for our conversation today. So cyber attacks against Microsoft 365 tenants are accelerating, and attackers are now using AI to move faster than ever. The window between a new vulnerability and simple misconfigurations and real-world exploitations keeps shrinking, turning everyday admin oversights into high-impact incidents. John and I are going to dig into why Microsoft 365 is no longer just your productivity backbone, but also one of your most critical security priorities. I've got several questions for you here, my friend. Let's start with this one. Why has Microsoft 365 become such a critical security priority rather than just a productivity platform?
Wow, thank you very much indeed, John. What an intro. Great. By the way, a little aside here. One of my first jobs in cyber was installing the very first ever commercial antivirus software that was available. It's called Dr. Solomon's Antivirus. I had to install it on Lotus Notes for Windows NT 3.51. And I had to do it using disks.
Dear God.
It wasn't much fun, ladies and gentlemen. So, I spent a lot of time in cyber, and I'm going to say something now which will come as absolutely no surprise to the people here today, I'm guessing, and that is that there's never really been a security challenge quite like Microsoft 365. I'm going to illustrate that with an anecdote. Yeah, I want you to imagine it's, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And at that time, I was working with classified networks. So high assurance networks, high class networks, and low class networks, and the need to interchange information securely between them. Now, in those days, there were key devices, key pieces of equipment that were needed in order to ensure that secure interchange, or there would have been a directory server, for example. So basically Active Directory, okay? Now, this is 10 or 15 years ago, so if someone had come to me then and said, I've got an idea. What we're going to do is we're going to put Active Directory in the cloud. That's what I said, that was a crazy idea. Why would you want to do something like that? No, forget about that. But then someone might say, well, I've got an even better idea. Let's build on top of it an ecosystem, collecting all kinds of stuff into it we don't have any direct control over, make external applications and integrate with it. And then we'll go one step further and we'll build an entire digital ecosystem, an entire digital workspace on that foundation. Now I'm thinking this guy's got really crazy ideas, but no, he's going to go further. He's going to say, well, we've got all these fantastic applications, probably more than you know, more than you even know how they work, more than you know how they work so that you're confident about their resilience and their security. And then we're going to have, obviously, messages flowing in and out. We'll have people that work there, but we'll also have guests, external users hanging out in this workspace we've built, along with external files and even applications that have got very elevated privileges into this environment. Now, someone has said that 15 years ago, you'd have said they're absolutely crazy. There's no way that something like that should be being taken seriously. But that's exactly where we are today. This is Microsoft 365, an entire digital workspace built on a foundation of Entra, which is essentially the modern incarnation of Active Directory, in the cloud, exposed to a whole bunch of things that you have no direct control over. And this change has happened subtly, it's happened over time, and it's a huge shift. The idea of taking your most sensitive digital assets and putting them into a collaboration space online, used by all kinds of people, some of whom you know, some of whom you don't, of going beyond Word in the cloud, Office in the cloud, to a point where we're talking about a very broad range of tools and applications, over 60 of them, and we'll come on to the detail of that later, presents some unique challenges, not least because, let's be frank, we're not really talking about something designed for security, we're talking about something designed for collaboration.
Right. And
that therefore needs a considerable amount of work to make it resilient, the R word, the subject of today's conversation. Microsoft 365 tenant resilience, what it is, and how you go about building it. John.
So has the threat landscape changed since, those early days when it comes to Microsoft 365 tenants? Are they more exposed today than they were a year ago?
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite alarming to see the rate of change, really. There are a couple of factors going on. There's the fact that Microsoft 365 is becoming ever more critical to organizations. And there are some very contemporary news stories to bear that out. And we'll touch on one of them as we go through our conversation today. That more and more stuff is interconnected into Microsoft 365, but also at the same time that the threat actors are using automation. Obviously, they're using inevitably AI, and they're doing these things to basically industrialize things like identity attacks, social engineering, API-based theft. The risk has increased not because 365 has got intrinsically weaker in some way, but because of our identity and our data has got ever more centralized there. Integrations, data sprawl, these things have exploded, and attackers have got basically even better at navigating and exploiting even the simple things, even the mundane things, misconfigurations, and exploiting them at scale. So they're industrializing attacks on Microsoft 365. AI has raised the floor for the attacker. Code and script generation is turnkey. And nation state and sophisticated criminal activity is focusing on this amazing platform, this collaborative platform, and it's an intimidating threat as much as accidental misconfiguration. In fact, of course, accidental misconfiguration is what these guys are looking to take advantage of. So we've got more permissions, more apps, less oversight, and therefore we need to have an increasing focus on resilience. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What resilience is and why it's important. Okay, John?
Is the increased use of AI by malefactors, is it accelerating exploitation of Microsoft 365 weaknesses?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, it's a case of go faster, go wider. So you can use AI to supercharge, phishing and business email compromise against 365 accounts. You can personalize language and style. You can mirror internal tone, all that kind of thing. But also you've got some pretty sophisticated ability to do research, reconnaissance, automated reconnaissance, and look for misconfigurations, harvest detail from misconfigurations, get detail from Teams and SharePoint content that shouldn't really be being shared, for example, and look for those easy ways in. So weak conditional access policies, for example, and absence of multi-factor authentication. Too much sprawl in terms of too many admins having too many permissions, and that's something we're going to go on and talk about later on. So the other thing you've got what AI is enabling people to do is take advantage of APIs and the app ecosystem. We all know 365 is heavily API and app driven, and so AI makes it easier to find ways to weaponize that. And of course, finally, once a tenant's been compromised, or an app integration has been compromised, it lets the attacker extract value from data much faster. You know, there were some significant examples in the UK retail food sector last year of pretty serious compromises. I don't profess to know the details of them, but one feature which was clear was that the collaborative platform that's 365 was being used by attackers to such a degree that emails were going out saying, don't go to Teams meetings without your camera on, make sure everyone has a camera on, make sure you know who everyone on camera is, because those organizations were aware that they were being penetrated to that depth. And that's the scary part. John.
Disastrous. Okay, we talked a little bit off camera about hidden resiliency gap in Microsoft 365. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
Yeah, this is one of my big things, John. Right, so cyber resilient enterprise. What does that actually mean in the context of Microsoft? So first of all, let's define what we're on about. So back in the day, people bought cybersecurity, yeah, and they bought it to stop bad things, and that was great. Problem came that sometimes it stopped bad things, sometimes it didn't, and then they'd be asked what plan B was, yeah, and there wasn't really much of a plan B sometimes. So resilience as a concept, as we know, is emerged as a more nuanced approach, acknowledging that bad things will happen, asking how you're going to deal with them. I'm really proposing a number of stages. You need to be able to prevent bad things, sure. You need to be able to detect bad things. You want to be able to respond when they happen in some hopefully elegant fashion. You want to be able to recover as quickly and as elegantly as you can, and you want to learn, if possible, to help you in the future. So it's a set of processes and procedures, not just technology, but processes and procedures. So if you're going to build any kind of resilience, you need to address those capabilities. And when it comes to Microsoft 365, that's no easy challenge. You've got 60 plus applications and services, personal productivity tools, platform as a service, software as a service, a massive and very sophisticated suite of collaboration tools, an entire security stack. You've got your server room, remember one of those, in the cloud, with lots of people, with lots of keys to all the doors, each of them with very broad levels of privilege when they get inside. And not a very easy way to see what on earth's going on. So if you want to build a cyber resilient enterprise, one that's going to do its best to prevent and detect, respond and recover and learn, if you're going to build that in, you've got to build it into the way you look at Microsoft 365, yeah? Because 365 is integral to the organization. So we know what cyber resilience is. We know we need to address it in Microsoft. How you go about doing that is the key thing in practical terms, to your phrase, John. And I think that it comes down to 5 key pillars, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail as we go through about what those key pillars are. But first of all, you need to make sure that you're deploying an appropriately hardened tenant in the first place. You have to be pretty ruthless about the amount of privilege you're giving, administrative privilege you're giving, and who you're giving it to. That server room with the revolving door and all the people with all the keys. You want to be able to detect when there's some kind of change to your config, whether that's accidental and the config's just drifting away out of alignment with what's good, or whether it's malicious, so there's somebody loose inside the wire and they're making config changes to meet their own needs. You want to be able to back up your config and restore it, and that's a key one we're going to focus on today. And finally, it will be good to have some automation to help you make your team more operationally resilient in dealing with all of this. So we'll talk through those 5 pillars. Before we leave this kind of introduction to resilience and the 5 pillars, I just want to say one thing. If you're thinking this is just some noise from a vendor, which is understandable in the industry we're all working, resilience has acquired a certain urgency, because pretty well everywhere in the world now there are regulatory or legislative frameworks that demand that organizations address the issue of resilience. You'd be hard pressed wherever your organization is and whatever your core line of business is, what you do, to tell me that you don't have someone from a legislative or a regulatory perspective saying you need to back stuff up and you need to be able to prove you've done it. Or you need to show that you've got plans in place for when things go wrong and explain how you're working to make those plans better. So whether it's a sector-specific regulator or a national government, either way, there's an impetus. In fact, it's not just national and a pan-national level across Europe, for example, to address the issue of making organizations more cyber resilient. And 365, tenant resilience, goes right to the heart of that. John.
So what are the most common Microsoft 365 misconfigurations attackers tend to exploit first?
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Because everyone likes the glamour of the zero-day exploits. You know, zero-day exploits are dead interesting and exciting, and I've worked in organizations dealing with that for many, many years. But I think actually the reality for many is a lot more mundane than that. We did a survey recently, actually, on the state of AI in 365, and we interviewed 500 odd admins and asked them how they saw their administration of their tenant. 82% said that they were suffering from an operational burden trying to manage Microsoft 365, and that it was a severe burden. In fact, 35% reported it was sufficiently severe that they'd had to report security or compliance incidents, and that those were all tied to simple Microsoft misconfigurations. So it's the little things, yeah? Although Microsoft talks about secure by default, for example, there's a range of configurations that are not configured in a secure way out of the box. Just take a simple one, allowing legacy authentication protocols. So we should have MFA set up with an associated conditional access policy, but there's always a risk, and we'll go on and look at this in detail a little later on, that someone or something somewhere will have a legacy authentication set up, so basic authentication. And that can be guessed or extracted with simple social engineering. So we're not talking about glamorous zero-day exploits, we're just talking about being able to take advantage of a simple default setting or lack thereof. And yet the result, if a threat actor is able to take advantage of it, well, that can be disastrous. Sure.
So, okay, so which of these misconfigurations are usually the result of simple admin oversight rather than sophisticated failure?
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of factors here. So I think the first one comes down to something I mentioned a moment ago, which is the tenant appropriately hardened in the first place? You wouldn't take an endpoint or a server and just kind of sling it out there without going through a fairly structured process of hardening it, locking it down. And yet it is often the case that tenants have been put to use without thought being given to those processes. And I'll just give you a little example now. So there's an organization called CIS, I think it's Center for Internet Security, I think it's called. They publish security best practice benchmarks for a whole range of different platforms, and one of them is Microsoft 365. You may or may not know, but the current version has 140 recommendations for security best practices that you should employ with Microsoft 365. Some of them probably not terribly relevant to this conversation, but a good 90 odd are. So a good starting point when it comes to seeing quite how you can protect yourself from little misconfigurations being taken advantage of is to say, well, am I actually able am I actually confident and happy that I could put out there a tenant that's been hardened in line with those kinds of best practice benchmarks? These are things covering how the tenant is configured. I'm not talking about whether someone's, done something on their endpoint or whatever. I'm talking about the heart of your organization, the tenant configuration. So first thing, has the tenant been appropriately hardened in the first place? Second thing, is there a way of monitoring that tenant configuration, either for drift, so admins make changes for expediency's sake, just make changes to get things done, or for covert malicious tampering. So in other words, someone has been able to get in and is routinely going around to make changes, for example, to provide themselves with persistence inside the tenant, so if they get locked out of one door, they can come back in through another, or to exfiltrate data in some way, shape, or form. So we just touched on the first couple of principles of our resilience plan here: tenant hardening, looking at the tenant the same way you would any other server, hardening it before you deploy it, authentication, password complexity, update frequency, but all 90 of these recommendations. And then the second area, the area of, are we monitoring that config to make sure we know if it's being tampered with? Okay. Tampering with configs is something that threat actors like to do in 365. They like to do it because they know that it's pretty hard, if not impossible, for anyone to see what's going on. You've got this complicated platform, 10,000 individual configuration settings across 60-odd applications and services with multiple admin GUIs. It's pretty hard to get a quick, clear, simple picture if somebody's tampering with your config. And these applications and configurations are fundamental to the business quite often. Making some kind of tampering change, or even if some kind of accidental drift takes place and there's a change that way, it doesn't just make a little change to the individual application, it potentially affects the security posture of the entire organization. Microsoft doesn't really have ways to tell you when stuff's going on unless you know where to look and you're prepared to dig deep quite often. And that's why, you see examples of tampering, and why tampering's been put at the fore, if you will, of risks, exposures for organizations. You can see a few stats here that kind of illustrate that point. Examples of the perception that's grown up that really tampering is something, config tampering is something that has to be dealt with. Equally, there's the other side of the coin. It's not been tampered with by a bad person. The config's just drifted. It's drifted away from your best practice, your CIS best practice, and that happens. People make simple mistakes. Admins are overwhelmed. The stats prove it. And Microsoft 365 admins are really under the cosh. And expediency plays a part. You just need to get something done, and you need to get something done quick. And all of that can contribute to undermining the resilience of the tenant itself. And we need to have confidence that that's not taking place. Before we close this particular area of our conversation today, I'll just say one more thing to put it even more context. I'll just outline the magnitude of the environment that the overwhelmed admin is trying to deal with. 10,000 plus configuration settings, over 60 applications and services. I don't know how many admin GUIs there are. It's a number, I can't remember now, but I'm going to say it's between 6 and 10, let's say. The point is that's for one tenant. Many organizations, inside many organizations, the Microsoft team is responsible for multiple tenants. Maybe they've got test and dev and production. Maybe they're a service provider providing services to multiple organizations within their organization. Local government in the States is a good example. 9, 10, 11 separate tenants all being managed by a single organization. So there's a big challenge here in terms of the configuration being appropriately hardened and being monitored carefully. Okay, John.
Help me understand what makes Microsoft 365 configuration management so difficult, even for well-staffed IT and security teams. I mean, you've talked a little bit about this, but can you say more?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we all know a fundamental thing now, which is identity is key. It used to be all about perimeters. Now it's all about identity, and the ability to compromise or to acquire identity is really the secret to unlocking the tenant completely. And you know, we're in a strange place. We have organisations where there are far too many admins with far too much privilege, and we have organisations where there are a small number of admins with lots of privilege, and everything escalates to them, and they're totally and utterly onto the cosh. And I'll bet you there are people on this session now who can, you know, empathise with either or both of those statements. I don't profess to know the detail of the striker attack that took place 5-6 days ago now, to the medical equipment firm that was compromised by a nation state, well, by an organisation probably operating on behalf of a nation state. But one thing is clear, and that is they managed to gain global admin access to that tenant in order to use Intune in order to wipe the endpoint devices. And that gives a simple example of the gravity and the speed with which compromise can take place. And it's often because there's a gap. There's a gap between what you think you've set up in terms of policies. They look lovely. They're in a book. Here are my policies. Look at them. And what's actually being enforced. And it's in that gap, that the threat actor is able to operate. John.
So how does platform complexity slow incident response when a tenant is under active attack?
Yeah, I mean, the complexity thing goes to the heart of this 10,000 configuration settings, these multiple admins, these many workloads, external guests, PowerShell complexity, dozens of admin roles, no visibility of how well the tenant's been aligned to your policies in reality. Yeah? And that's essentially the backstory here, because you've got no real centralized way of seeing at a glance the state of your configuration across that massive attack surface, across that very broad estate. Yeah. Of course, Microsoft provides lots of great native tooling. I'm not suggesting for a moment it doesn't. However, it's quite specialist, and you need to very frequently have recourse to PowerShell, have recourse to understanding incredibly complicated auditing and log files. And the reality is that just creates a playground, if you're not careful, for threat actors to operate in. And that has an impact when it comes to, you know, how quickly it's possible to respond. So, you know, if you've got a platform that's complex and you have no single pane of glass view of it, you have no one place you can go to see what's going on. It's very hard to respond quickly when you're facing some kind of an attack or some kind of compromise. You've got multiple admin interfaces, you've got complex logs, you've got an over-dependence on PowerShell. If PowerShell Pete isn't in the office this week, then you're in trouble. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And ultimately, you end up with being in a situation where there's no easy way to say when something's changed.
Could you share an example of how a seemingly minor misconfiguration can turn into a high-impact incident?
I kind of knew you were going to ask that one. Because it's the obvious one. It's so obvious, but actually it's almost certainly relevant to what's been in the news this last few days with that compromise I referred to earlier. So one conditional access exception in your policies, and you lose your entire tenant. Now, that seems completely minor, doesn't it? But let's just walk it through. So organization's got a conditional access policy. It requires MFA for all users. Of course it does. Why wouldn't it? You know, everyone knows this. But there's an exception. MFA is not required for legacy applications group or a service accounts group, a group somewhere. And it was basically, these groups contained a few normal user accounts, but someone added temporarily them were there, so you know, some scripts or apps didn't break, so they were kind of quietly in a corner and they looked harmless. And what happens, of course, is there's an initial compromise, a low tier one, taking advantage of the absence of MFA. And the attacker obtains a password for one of those exception users. No MFA is required, so conditional access allows sign-in from any location, any device. And now the attacker has valid 365 M365 credentials and a token into Entra, bypassing the 100% MFA enforcement. They can now move laterally quite easily. They can, look for HR, IT, legal department users. They've got the beginnings of a serious data breach. They can almost certainly put some kind of compromised app in place, something impersonating an IT app, for example, issue it out to a vulnerable user, ask them to provide consent for that app to be installed, and the user accepts it because it seems to be from a legitimate source. And now they've got an app with elevated privileges, permissions operating within the tenant, and they've got persistent access. So they can wipe all your data or steal all your data. So what started out as one MFA exception, one lax consent setting, has turned into essentially a tenant-wide breach. John.
Okay, so what are the warning signs that an organization's 365 admin model is too complex to support fast, effective response?
Yeah, I mean, we go back to issues of complexity and control once more. So admins, admins are overwhelmed, and this manifests itself in one of two directions. Quite often you get administration centralized with a very small number of people in central admin. You probably encounter this, you maybe even be one of them. If you are, you have my sympathies. Yeah, you're dealing with everything from onboarding a new user 1 minute to some detailed forensic analysis of a security incident the next. Yeah, and as I say, the report I mentioned earlier bears this out. There's a massive sense of operational burden, lots of people having to deal with configuration mistakes, and a big lack of clarity or visibility to what's changed, who has access, or why they do. So that's one scenario you've got there. Basically, a very small number of people, and everything apart from have you remembers to switch the computer on, type help desk queries, gets elevated up to them. So they are totally and utterly overrun. And the other scenario, which is probably equally as common, is essentially too many admins having way too much privilege for the tenant to be properly resilient. And that's in the nature of the way Microsoft works. The very broad privileges it gives, incredibly broad ones. The ability, if I'm involved in administering SharePoint, for example, to be able to administer the SharePoint sites for the production facility in South America, but also because I'm a SharePoint admin, potentially the ability to administer the finance SharePoint sites in the head office in Switzerland. Now, reality is that level of privilege is not needed and is dangerous, because if those accounts become compromised in the way we've just discussed, then very quickly it's possible for the tenant to be owned, the tenant to be taken over completely. But it's in the nature of how Microsoft operates its roles and its privileges that this becomes a risk, and a very big risk. Admins have too much privilege. It's as simple as that. And the way I look at it is just think of it like an apartment block. Apartments are great. I love them. They're fantastic. Yeah. But if you share the building, you don't share the whole building. You've got a lock on your door. You don't have someone coming in and helping themselves to a cup of coffee or having a sleep in your bed. Well, I imagine you don't. Now, here's the thing. Because there's no real rigorous administrative segmentation internally within the tenant, what you have is a situation where someone can come in and rove quite freely within that apartment block. Yeah, and it's to do with how Microsoft privileges essentially work, and it enables the kinds of situations like the SharePoint admin who can access sites in South America and sites in the Switzerland headquarters. It enables that to happen, and it creates challenges for people moving from on-premise architectures towards the cloud, because they've been used to having rigorous segmentation as part of their on-premise environment, and that goes in essence. You can't create your own self-contained flats inside the tenant, or at least not very easily. what's necessary if you're going to make your tenant resilient is to find some kind of balance across all that. John.
So what daily admin tasks should teams address first to improve tenant resilience?
Okay, so I think there's multiple levels to this, okay? So you want to be able to check you're enforcing resilience at a configuration level, at a collaboration level, and a user level. And that's difficult to do without visibility, without some kind of single pane of glass view, so you can see what's going on, okay? Well, that's the ideal situation. Then there are the ongoing governance tasks, and these go hand in hand with what I just referred to. So that's things like, are you conducting your access reviews regularly? Are you trying to deal with SharePoint sprawl? Is someone looking at app registrations on whether they're still needed or whether the secrets are still valid, all that kind of good stuff. And then really, I suppose there's the question of the detail of your configuration. Most organizations, the configurations, it changes. People will make changes for expediency's sake, or in order to get something done quickly, whatever it might be. So is there a way to see, if necessary on a daily, but if not, then certainly on a weekly basis, what's changing, and down to very specific levels of detail, so you can identify if there's tampering or drift in the config. John.
Okay, so how can organizations reduce the time between identifying a risky misconfiguration and actually remediating it?
Yeah, and this goes back to what I was saying about the configs, because dashboards are great, but a more fundamental point than that is you want to be able to see exactly what's changed. Yeah, CoreView, for example, monitors the tenant configuration, records what's going on continuously, so you actually will actually drill down and say, oh, look, at this time on this date, using this account, these 3 Intune policies were changed. This conditional access policy was modified. This Defender policy was turned off, whatever it might be. Yeah, and you can get that on demand. You can get that delivered to you on a scheduled basis. And of course, Microsoft's native tooling will give you alerts and notifications. But what we're talking about here is a consolidated picture, yeah, and something that's going to give you the ability to get right on with the job straight away, as quickly as you can, when it comes to identifying risky misconfigurations, whether they're accidental or intended, and reduce your time to remediation. John.
Okay, kind of a big question. When it comes to backing up Microsoft 365 tenant configuration, who usually thinks they own it and who actually does?
Yeah, this is the big one. Elephants in the room and all that. So backups are important. We all know that. Everyone backs up their data, don't they? I do. Or someone does for me. At least I trust that they do. So your data, right, in Microsoft 365 terms, your files, your emails, all that good stuff. Yeah. And most organizations I speak to, they have a plan, or they have providers who deal with that for them. But what about the configuration? What about these 10,000 odd settings that I mentioned? Well, we surveyed a bunch of Microsoft customers, and it was fascinating just how many of them thought that Microsoft backed up their tenant configuration. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the shocking news is they don't. Yeah, they don't back up your tenant configuration, and what the survey also revealed is that a lot of people thought that maybe it wasn't really needed. Those that were under, those that understand their regulatory responsibilities, however, have figured this out. I spoke to some organizations in Australia where they have, in the public sector, there are regulations about backup. And they're saying, well, how do you do it? Well, what we do is we use Microsoft Paint to take screen captures of the important parts of the configuration, and we paste them into Excel, and we write in the cell beside it what the purpose of the configuration setting is. Well, not a very scalable way of going about things, I would suggest. So this is a big issue, and again, an analogy is a useful thing here. Think of it like a glass of water. Think about your tenant as the glass, and the water is the data inside it. Now, if we assume everybody here on this session today with us has got a good, robust data backup strategy, they've got their emails and their documents backed up. So if they lose control of the tenant, if that's accidental, or if the tenant is taken over by a threat actor and they need to find a way to bring it back in whole or in part, now they've got the water. The problem is they haven't got the glass. The glass is smashed. So where are they going to put it? Yeah. Your tenant is the glass. Microsoft 365 tenant is the glass. You've got no place to put your data. There's no place to put the water if you don't have a good backup of your configuration. So if I've got one takeaway from people on this session today, just one, it's this. Backing up your tenant configuration is super critical. When you go back to the office or back to your day job or back to business as usual, ask around. Ask around and just ask, how do we do our configuration backup so that we could recover in the event of a disaster? You might be surprised to discover just how little awareness of the need for this there is, and actually how important it is that it needs to be addressed. Okay, John.
Okay, look, I hate to be the dumbest guy in the room, but why is backing up data alone not enough when recovering from a 365 compromise?
Well, there's two things. Because likelihood is your config's been carefully crafted over a long period of time and has a lot of detail underpinning it about how your policies are set up for identity, how they're set up for data loss, for example, how they're set up for your endpoint security, all this stuff. So conjuring that out of the air, if you have to, because you haven't got a tenant configuration, is going to add a lot of latency to your ability to come back online and recommence business as usual. Not only that, but the one key thing you do need in these situations is you need precise forensics. You want to know exactly what was changed, when and by whom, because that's going to give you some seriously good intel as to whether this was an accident, whether this was deliberate, which areas of the tenant were potentially compromised and how. And ideally, you want to be able to individually roll back those changes if necessary. So you can literally roll them back item by item until you get back to what you could term a kind of a golden image of your tenant config, something you can rely on and roll out. Sure.
Okay, what should organizations be thinking about when it comes to tenant configuration, restore, and recovery readiness?
Yeah, I think look, the three things we've touched on are the three things to take away here. So first of all, it would be a good idea to make sure you have some kind of underlying health check of your tenant to understand the areas of exposure that you face. And there are plenty of organizations that can help do that. Secondly, you should be looking at those CIS benchmarks and comparing your tenant with them. That's not to say you need to have a one-for-one, identical mapping. Everybody's environment is different. Of course it is, and everybody will not have the same golden image, so to speak. Yeah, but those benchmarks are a really good way of looking at how resilient your tenant is and how resilient it ought to be. And then thirdly, you need to be looking at your disaster recovery strategy, your backup and restoration of your tenant configuration itself. John.
Okay, for teams that know they have these gaps, but can't fix everything at once, what are the first three practical steps you'd recommend?
Yeah, I think health checks, benchmarks, and DR really go to the heart of that. They're going to give the team something they can get their teeth into quickly. There's lots of other areas that are going to help with resilience, things like having good governance policies, for example, things like making sure that you have an appropriate plan for reviewing access on a regular basis. But fundamentally, health checks, CIS benchmarks, or at least comparing the tenant with the benchmarks and understanding how you might get towards something that would be a good benchmarked tenant, and also a DR strategy. John?
Okay, final question. How does, because you're here for, how does CoreView help organizations simplify administration, reduce the risk of misconfiguration, and strengthen 365 tenant resilience?
Yeah, I know, and I'm no surprise, obviously, that resilience is kind of what CoreView is all about.
Right.
Specifically, 365 resilience. That we have a whole range of customers, including some of the biggest tenants in the world are customers of CoreView, and we basically exist to try and help them build resilience into their platform using the 5 pillars that I've mentioned. So, by providing ways to harden the tenant, by helping them to restrict and remove excess administrative privilege. We have a functionality called virtual tenancy. Basically enables an organization to create virtual tenant segments and thus create administrative boundaries. So it's perfectly possible to say, my good friend John shall only be responsible for administering the finance department in France. And then John will only see the users and the administrative tasks that he needs to perform for the finance department in France. He'll have no visibility or ability to control or change at an administrative level what happens for the manufacturing facility in Oregon. So virtual tenant segmentation provides a way of removing excess privilege, and that's really important when it comes to reducing the attack surface and helping restrict opportunities for lateral movement. So obviously we do provide the ability to understand in great forensic detail when a tenant's been tampered with or when drift has occurred. We back up tenant configurations. Yeah? That means that whatever the nature of the disaster that strikes, so be it just a discontented internal admin on their way out of leaving the organization that does something bad, or be that some major incident, that you have a way to understand at a forensic detail level what happened and how to recover from it, and you have the backup that you can use to recover, so you can instantly rewind and get your tenant back in a matter of a very short space of time. And then finally, there's this whole issue of the 5th pillar I mentioned right at the very beginning, which is all about operational resilience, because we've said admins are overrun, overwhelmed, overworked, and so CoreView provides automation, essentially automation to enable things like joining, moving, leaving processes to happen smoothly and automatic, to devolve administration down to a business unit level. So, if there are access reviews that need to take place, can we devolve them to the business manager responsible, all that kind of thing. So a lot of no-code automation, essentially, to perform the relatively mundane but important tasks. So that's what we do. We help organizations with the 5 pillars. And in conclusion, I think all I'd add is it's not a sprint. It's a marathon for sure, and it is all about making this fit for your particular organization. Technology plays an important part, but it's about the people and your particular security posture, if you will. But having regard to hardening the tenant, removing excess privilege, dealing with configuration tampering and backup and restore, and building some operational resilience will go a long way to ensuring that this incredibly powerful but complex platform has some resilience built into it. John.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, that's all my questions. Let's get to some questions from our attendees. Remember, guys, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. So our first one here is from Ash, who's wondering, what would you recommend in terms of where and how to store a Microsoft 365 tenant configuration backup so that it is secure?
Yeah, Ash, thank you very much for that. That's a good one. Look, the most important thing is that it's stored separately from the tenant itself. Now, that may sound amusingly, if not blindingly obvious, but let me just expand on that for a moment. There are technologies that attempt to deal with the backup issue by effectively creating a backup as a part of the tenant housing, if you will. Yeah. And the problem with that, of course, is if you lose control of your tenant, be it because you've done something dumb or because a bad person has done something bad, then having a backup that's part of the tenant doesn't really help you very much. You know what I'm saying? So the configuration backup essentially, it needs to be stored separately in the cloud behind a break glass account or something similar. And this is kind of how CoreView approaches that topic. But that's the best way to ensure that you've got the config backup in the level of detail you need, with the forensic analysis capability you need, and with the ability to get back to the golden image. You've got that offline from being inside the tenant. But I hope that answers the question, Ash.
Okay, here's one from Mal, who's wondering, how can AI help to defend and manage a Microsoft 365 tenant?
Wow. Okay, so this is a really hot one, and if you're of advanced years as I am, then you tend to look somewhat suspiciously at the wonderful world of AI. But the truth is, I mean, I think one of the things we've discovered is that with the right kind of guardrails, we believe AI can be a useful assistant for Microsoft 365 admins, essentially some kind of, if you will, a wingman for the admin. And I'm going to illustrate what I mean by that, because it's easy to go, oh no, more AI nonsense from more vendors, and you know there's a security risk there, which there is. You have to find the right way to mitigate that. But let me illustrate it with an example. So assume the finance department's under attack of some sort. Maybe there are signs, maybe there's even been some intelligence, and it's been targeted. So the security teams all over this, obviously, the Microsoft team ought to be able to help in some way. So what could they do? Well, they could check and remove any unused accounts from the finance team. Okay, that's a good idea. We don't want those lurking around in case someone was able to take control of one and give themselves some privileged access somehow, or just use it to go on and get privileged access. So we need to go and query Entra, document the inactive users, and deprovision the accounts. We probably ought to ensure that MFA is being properly enforced across that team, with a conditional access policy set up for all the finance group. That's a smart move again. We should probably look and see if there are any external users hanging out in groups that the finance team are using, because that's a sneaky trick. You know, there could be bad guys that are using these groups, and we should probably have a quick check and see who's in there, what we can learn about that. And we ought to make sure that across the finance team there aren't any mailboxes with strange settings like alter forwards going on to external domains, things like that, because that would be a concern. So there are 4 examples there of things that you know would be sensible to do, just as a matter of belt and braces, just a matter of you know, let's support the endeavour of keeping the finance team safe. And there's also probably between 4 and 10 hours of work there, depending on whether you're using the various admin interfaces or PowerShell or a combination of the two. So if you had an appropriately guardrailed AI assistant, you could take that response time down to a matter of a few minutes. You ask the AI to identify the inactive accounts in the finance department according to parameters you specify, and it does it straight away. You ask it to lock those accounts, it checks you want to do it, and then it does it straight away. You ask it to ensure MFA is set up properly for the department, again, straight away. Or whether there are external users there, again, straight away, or any auto forwarding on domain. So all things you can do in a matter of seconds, interacting with an AI assistant in the same way that you'd interact with ChatGPT. But that assistant basically acting as your wingman, if you will. And actually, this is an area we're working on. If you take a look at some of the stuff on our website, you'll see that we've got a report. I've referenced it a couple of times on the state of AI in Microsoft. We've actually got a couple of announcements coming out regarding technology that we're bringing to market in this area. So, Mal, was it? I think it was Mal. If this is an area of interest, then watch this space.
Yeah, definitely follow up on that. Okay, this one. Okay, this is more of a statement than a question, but I'd kind of like to get your reaction to it. This is from Laura, who says, Microsoft makes you configure so much via PowerShell, which is a nightmare, mostly invisible. This is a big part of the problem.
I would be inclined to agree, and I think you know, I always say to my colleagues, look, if you're a massive corporation, the chances are you can afford to go out there and buy yourself an army of absolute PowerShell gurus who can configure whatever you want, whenever you want to. I'm guessing that's what happens. But how many people use Microsoft 365 across the world? Organizations of every shape and size, yeah? And many of them have neither the in-house skills nor do they have the capacity to do that kind of thing. And that's why CoreView exists. CoreView exists specifically to provide a single pane of glass view of the challenges we've been discussing that you can drive as a piece of software that wraps around your existing 365 tenant.
Okay, got one here from, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Harold. I am not sure if I missed this, but what is the average recovery time for a Microsoft 365 incident?
Oh, I'm not sure that I can give an answer to that question, but I probably know people who can. So let me commit an act of gross cowardice and say, let me make a point of coming back to you on that with some kind of an answer from someone with a great deal more experience for the subject than me.
That's awesome. Yikes, that hour just flew by. That's all the questions I have. That's all the time we have for questions from the audience. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, John. John Stevenson, for an informative conversation. Many, many thanks. And many thanks to the folks at CoreView for making this conversation possible. We couldn't have done it without them, folks. Hey, thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.